Ailsa? Okay,
Yes.
over to
Can you hear
you.
me okay?
Yes, brilliant.
Fantastic. Hello, I'm Ailsa Dixon and I am a professional traditional storyteller. I grew up in Aberdeenshire, in Cruden Bay, if anybody kens where Cruden Bay is. And I'm currently based in Edinburgh, where I'm a student and where I'm working as a storyteller and a musician and doing a lot of work as within the climate activist circles. Um, I grew up in climate activism. I was just the right age for Fridays for Future for all of the youth climate cohort that was going on, and I have continued to do that kind of work into my young adulthood. I do work with the Young Greens. I do work with conservation charities. But a lot of my contemporaries, a lot of my peers who were super, super invested in climate activism, who from the ages of 8, 9, 10 were incredibly aware of the threats of climate change, I've seen this trend of apathy, of burnout, and of disconnect, which I know isn't only affecting young people, it's affecting people across the board, but particularly with my generation, it's like the threat of climate devastation and the idea that you have to solve it all yourself, that it's your responsibility to fix everything and save the world is almost too much, so you shut down. And I've come to the realization that in order to work the best for climate, you have to do, what everyone has to. You have to recycle, you have to do your bit, but also you have to play to your specific strengths. And my specific strength is working as a traditional storyteller, working as a traditional musician. And going back into traditional mythologies, I keep coming across this idea of the connection, this triangle of people, of story and place. This shows up within Scottish, Welsh, Irish mythologies and mythologies around the world. And I think it's incredibly applicable to contemporary society as well. The simple idea is that the people that live in the land, in order to coexist in harmony with the land, have to know the stories of the land, have to know the myths, the folk tales, and the recent history of the land. And if things are in balance, if the triangle is strong, yay, everything's good, essentially. So ultimately, a lot of my work focuses around trying to strengthen, trying to reconnect that triangle in different ways, which can look like working with young children, telling stories about place, telling stories about plants, telling stories about trees, telling stories that try and make them invested in that land, because ultimately, I believe that if people don't have an investment in the land around them, in the natural world around them, then they're not going to want to protect it. Then they don't have that emotional incentive to try and save the world, essentially. And one foolproof way to create emotional incentive is storytelling and is to have the narratives and the story and the history of place. Then people will be emotionally connected with them and be invested in protecting that place. So a lot of my work is involved in youth groups, working with young people that are involved in climate activism within organisations like This Is Rigged, within the Young Greens, or just generally attending protests, things like that, teaching them about storytelling, teaching them about communication techniques. But then also within my professional creative life, I'm creating shows. Like, for example, at the Fringe last year, I did this show called Hearus and Hasten. And Hearus and Hasten was a collaboration with another young Welsh traditional storyteller. And it focused on two different stories, the story of Asapatl and the Maes de Stórwyrm, which is an Orcadian legend about a Maes de Stórwyrm, about this great dragon, this great monster that attacks a nation. And in order to solve the problem, the community has to come together to share their collective knowledge. And they realized that in order to save the nation and to avert climate devastation, they have to blow up the monster by swimming inside it with a little boat, lighting it on fire from the inside, and then watching it explode. Spoiler alert, the dragon collapses into the Atlantic Ocean and starts burning and becomes the land of Iceland. But that's not really the main lesson we take away from it. And the young Welsh storytellers' story was around the avanc, which is a creature from Wales that also drains lochs, cuts down crops, cuts down forests, and again involved the community coming together to learn from the wisdom of the elder people within that community, to share their collective knowledge and to work together to avert tragedy. And I think in that story, they rehomed the avanc into a big lake in Snowdonia where it couldn't hurt anyone. So that story had a very positive ending, unlike the story of the avanc. I am currently working on a commission with Perth Museums, who have an exhibition about the unicorn, the national animal of Scotland, to talk about kindness and the climate crisis with young people. And the story of the coming of the unicorn, I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to tell you a 15-minute story in about 2 minutes. It starts, as all of the best stories do, with a king who lived a long time ago. And he was wandering through the woods and he came across this bear. And as he did every time he came across a bear, he took his bow and arrow, he shot the bear in the heart. And for the first time in his entire life, as he saw the bear fall lifeless to the ground, he felt sadness in his chest. And he'd never experienced sadness before. It was a strange and foreign feeling. And he went home and he cried, and he'd never cried before, and it was strange. His cheeks were wet, and the queen didn't know how to cheer him up, didn't know how to comfort her husband. And she tried so hard for a day and a night and a night and a day and a day and a night and a night and a day. And eventually she tried everything she could. The king was still crying. And she decided that she was going to call a magician to the castle. And the magician arrived and then decided that what he was going to do was to create the most magnificent creature that had ever existed. So the king couldn't help but feel elated and want to cast up his tears and go out into the land again. And so he called together all of the magic within him. And he said a few special words. He sang a few special songs and created the most magnificent creature you have ever seen. It was a fantastic white horse. It had a horn, it had the tail of a lion, and it galloped out of the castle. It went round once, twice, 3 times, and the king looked out of his window and he began to laugh for the first time in months. And he went out hunting the unicorns over the hills, over the forest, through the lochs, around and around and around the land of Scotland. And eventually, he'd been hunting for so long, catching just a glimpse of hoof, a glimpse of hair, a glimpse of mane, a glimpse of horn. And eventually he realized that he was never going to catch the unicorn. And he went home and he called together all of the artists in the land. And he told them about the unicorn, and the sculptors began to make statues, and the painters painted, and the tapestry makers created the most magnificent tapestries of the unicorn that you have ever seen. And the stories of the unicorn spread throughout the land, and everybody fell in love with it and knew that they had to protect it. And the way to protect it was to keep the land safe, to make sure that the unicorn had safe spaces to roam freely. And that story is approximately 500, 600 years old. I've not changed a lot of it. And I tell it incredibly regularly with young people's groups, with old people's groups, to basically anyone. And everyone I tell it to finds different things within it. I was talking to a group of farmers recently who took themes of rewilding from the story. But essentially, when I'm working with young children, it boils down to kindness. It boils down to the connection between people, place, and story. How we can be kind to the people around ourselves, how we can be kind to the places to protect the unicorns, and how we can share the stories of the places so that more people are connected to that triangle. How long do I have left? I realize I haven't started a timer.
Probably about 5 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. I was belting through this because I completely lost track of time.
Yeah, I'm
Ah,
not keeping time very well myself, so carry on.
amazing. Oh, brilliant. I said that now and I've completely forgotten what I'm saying.
Unicorns.
Unicorns. Fantastic. I realize I've just rocked up and started talking about unicorns. Which is timely because I'm pretty sure that the previous speaker mentioned wanting a bag of unicorn skin, which I'm not entirely sure is really the message of this particular story. Um, um, so essentially, when I work with these stories, I usually tell the story and then we sit down and we have a discussion about it. We think about how it exists within the land around us. Sometimes the stories that I tell are very, very specific. I tell this story that comes specifically from Peterhead. That's about a fisherman interacting with a mermaid, and it has themes of our relationship between the land and the sea and overfishing. So I tell, but also Peterhead and the industries of Peterhead and the boom and bust and Peterhead's relationship with fishing and with oil and with climate. So sometimes the stories are incredibly specific to that particular community. Sometimes they're more general, but we might think about, for example, I was working with that story recently with a group of children from Edinburgh that are involved in something called the Green Team, which takes young people suffering with mental health difficulties out into the woods to do conservation. So we thought specifically about the forest near Edinburgh that they were in, and we thought about the scents and the smells and what it must have been like if the king was in that specific forest. And it really helped the young people engage on like a visceral, emotional level. And when they first came into the room with me, although they'd been out once or twice to the conservation work, they were still they were classic teenagers. They were kind of 13 to 16, and they weren't really enthused about giving up a lot of their weekends to go traipsing around in the mud. But after I'd told the story, after we'd sat and we discussed it for a long time, after we'd sat in it, after we had thought about what might have happened next. And when I tell these stories, usually they take quite a long time. There's quite a lot of interaction involved. They wanted to go back. They wanted to go back into the woods again of their own kind of volition. And when I tell stories like the stories I tell in Here Is and Hasten, I told it at, I performed the show Here Is and Hasten with my Welsh storytelling friend at a festival called Beyond the Border in Wales. There was an incredible moment when there was an older woman at the back that began to cry after we told it. And she had been completely burnt out and had been really involved in the climate activism community of South Wales, and had been so burnt out that she just left. She'd not gone back. She hadn't really been trying, but this reminded her, because the stories were so viscerally Welsh and they were so viscerally about community and togetherness and the stark realities of what happens to the land when there is inaction. That the next day she emailed myself and Fionn and said that she signed up to do more conservation work at the local, I think, RSPCA centre that she lived. So even though it sounds quite wishy-washy when I try and explain to people that storytelling has tangible effect, I have seen real evidence that it reduces apathy, it creates connection amongst communities, it helps fight burnout, and it has a demonstrable mental health impact. I'm sorry if that was rather rambling, but I hope this has helped in some way, and I think my time is well and truly up now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ailsa.